So I'm dividing this lecture on neocolonialism into two parts. The first part being specifically on colonialism of the old type. You don't need to know about colonialism in depth, in as much as you won't have to answer exam questions on colonialism in depth. However, you do need a bit of an understanding of colonialism in order to understand neocolonialism. So the kind of notes I suggest you make for this session on colonialism would be, well, it's up to you really. I'm giving you more detail than you're going to have to write about, but I think it's useful detail for understanding what came afterwards. So I'm often asked when we do these questions about North-South divide and so on by my students, well, how did this North-South divide come about? And the standard answer in the textbooks and the standard answer in Europe really would be the Industrial Revolution. And this, if you remember Johan Norberg's documentary Globalization is Good, he says that the global north embraced free market capitalism and that helped them to industrialize, and that's why the north got rich and everyone else stayed poor. But the Industrial Revolution only really explains how Europe got wealthy. It doesn't explain how the global south became poor. And I would argue that Norberg's assertion that everywhere used to be in poverty is effectively wrong. So there's another answer to this question of how did the North-South divide come about, which is colonialism. And in my mind, this is a much fuller answer, as it explains how the global south became impoverished, as well as how the Industrial Revolution in Europe was able to take place. So by colonialism we mean the direct political control of one country by another. And the era of European colonialism in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in the 19th century, came about through military conquest. So by 1900, by the beginning of the 20th century, Britain, France and a handful of other European powers had conquered the whole of Africa and Asia, with some very small exceptions such as Ethiopia. Now these empires by and large were military dictatorships governed by military officers of the European armies, with the population excluded from political power. And so the first point about colonialism is that it impoverished the global south. So in India, for example, under the Muslim Mughal Empire, before India's conquest by the British, India was a wealthy, productive, and this is very important, a manufacturing economy with a highly developed textile industry. It was estimated to be producing between 24 and 33% of global GDP. But Britain invaded the country and began to colonize it from 1757 onwards. And the British stayed for almost 200 years, 190 years actually. Now during that time, they turned the country from this wealthy, developed manufacturing economy to an impoverished agricultural provider of raw materials to Europe. So how did this happen? Well, in three main ways. First was the extortionate taxes that were levied on the Indian population. They were so high that many Indian producers were forced out of business, or farmers forced to sell their land, and British tax collectors actually systematically used torture on those who refused to pay by the 19th century, or who were unable to pay. Secondly, colonialism impoverished the global south through the closure of public works. So again, using India as an example, the Mughals in India had created very elaborate systems of irrigation, grain storage for famine relief, and various other public works, all of which were closed down by the British, who didn't want to fund them anymore. Early example of austerity measures, cuts to public spending, neoliberalism. And thirdly, the imposition of free trade was also greatly damaging to the colonized countries of the global south. So just like the structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF in the 80s and 90s, that's the 1980s and 90s, in the 17th and 18th century under direct colonialism, the British forced India to open up to free trade. This meant the country was flooded with cheap imported cloth from Britain, which was just beginning to get its own textile industry underway, effectively putting the Indian manufacturers out of business. And what happened to these manufacturers when they were put out of business is that they were then forced to basically labour on the new cotton plantations that were being established by the British in India. So they were effectively turned from producers of high-value finished manufactured products, that is finished textiles, they were turned into low-paid agricultural peasants, basically working on the British plantations, growing raw cotton to be shipped for the use in the British textile industry. Now, the combined effect of all of this was to turn the world's leading manufacturing economy, India, into an impoverished rural economy, agricultural economy, with its share of global GDP down from anywhere between 24 and 33%, anywhere between a quarter and a third before colonialism, down to 4.2% of global GDP at the end of the colonial period. So British rule really impoverished India, and the result of this impoverishment was that India suffered more famines during its 2 centuries of British rule than in the previous 1,000 years, with between 12 and 29 million famine deaths in the last 3 decades of the 19th century alone, according to historian Mike Davis. Just think about that, between 12 and 29 million deaths in famine in India. That were man-made famines as a result of British policy. They didn't have famines like this on this scale before because of the drought relief and other systems that the Mughals had in place before the British. 12 million is the low estimate. That's twice the number of people died in the Nazi Holocaust. So we're really talking about serious mass, unimaginably massive loss of life as a result of colonialism. India's first Prime Minister after independence, Nehru, pointed out that, quote, "a significant fact which stands out is that those parts of India which have been longest under British rule, such as Bengal, are the poorest today." And that's that's something that's true across the areas of the British Empire. It's true also in Africa, that those areas that had been targeted by the slave trade kidnappers for the longest, or that had been colonized the longest, are the poorest today. Similar stories could be told for almost every country in Africa, Asia and Latin America. Over the course of centuries of European rule, these economies were stripped of their raw materials and impoverished by colonialism. Africa actually suffered doubly. In the 19th century it suffered colonialism, but in the centuries before that, tens of millions of its working age population were kidnapped by Europeans and enslaved in the Americas. And the effect of this was to depopulate Africa, leaving the continent economically dislocated and reversing its economic development in ways that are arguably still felt today. And this is the thesis put forward by Walter Rodney in his classic book from, I think, the late 1960s, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, where he talks about the impact of both the slave trade and colonialism on creating the poverty that is still in Africa today. In fact, the scholar from Suriname, Sanju Hira, has carried out an extensive research program on the economic impact of colonialism. He has attempted to estimate the total damage to Africa, Asia and the Americas by Europeans during the colonial period. And what he does is he's added together the total value of unpaid rent on all the land that was stolen, plundered resources that were taken without paying for them, forced labour and slavery that was taken without obviously paying for it, along with compensation for human suffering, valued at levels established in Europe's own courts when someone has had damage done to them and they receive compensation. And he calculates that if reparations were to be paid for all of this, including compound interest of 3% per year, which is actually quite a low interest rate for these sort of cases, Hira estimates the total bill would be over $321 quadrillion. Now, but until I read this research, I'd never even heard of a quadrillion, right? A quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. A trillion is already 1,000 billion, and a billion is 1,000 million, so, well, I'll leave you to work out the number of noughts. But $321 quadrillion, it's a staggering amount. It's far more than there is resources on the planet or money on the planet. But it demonstrates the extremity of the damage caused by colonialism. So that's part of the story of how colonialism impoverished the global south. The other part is how did it enrich the global north. And it did this in 2 main ways. First of all, provision of raw materials. So having had their own industries destroyed, the unemployed craftsmen of places like Bengal in India and elsewhere were then put to work as forced labourers on huge new plantations owned by the British in India and other places, growing goods such as tea, cotton and also opium for the British. Opium was the most valuable commodity in the 19th century, the most valuable global commodity, and the British had an effective monopoly on it. The East India Company had huge opium plantations in India, which then they sold in China. And famously, in the middle of the 19th century, Britain actually went to war against the Chinese because the Chinese emperor tried to ban opium. So these were the raw materials for British industry, and this was a big source of Britain's wealth at the time. Other colonies provided, for example, sugar, cocoa, palm oil, which is an essential industrial lubricant, essential for the Industrial Revolution. Large quantities of that came from Africa. So all of these colonies provided the raw materials needed for British industry. Also timber from the colonies, very important for the growth of the British Navy. But as well as providing raw materials for the industrial process, colonialism also provided the global north with markets. So the colonies effectively provided, if you like, captive markets for the new mass-produced products being made in Europe. And without the hundreds of millions of colonial peoples to buy their goods, the British cotton industry, for example, could never have developed on the scale necessary for industrialization to be profitable. If the British were just producing cloths and fabrics and so on for the British market, it would not have been worth the capital investment in the huge factories that were the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, which started in the cotton industry, because the markets were just not big enough to make that level of investment worthwhile. It only became worthwhile and profitable because they had access to these huge colonial markets. Another aspect as well of the way that the North was enriched and the Industrial Revolution was facilitated by colonialism is that the global South, the colonies, because they were producing a lot of food for example, Britain, that freed up British people from farming, meant they didn't have to be in farming anymore, and therefore they could go and work in